Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. And welcome to Climate Change and Environmental Justice in Harlem. My name is Michael Flanagan. I'm a senior associate at the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce. And first off, we do want to apologize for the lines that are downstairs. This is a state process that requires identification of individuals coming into the building. And so, that's part of the reason for the delay. My pleasure this evening is to introduce our MC. Our Master of Ceremonies is Kendall Green. He's a general assignment reporter at Fox 5 News. His journalism career began way back as a part-time photographer. During his junior year at Jackson State University School of Journalism and Media Studies, he joined Fox 5 News after 2 years as a reporter and fill-in anchor for WMAR2 News in Baltimore, Maryland. The example of journalists both in front and behind the camera in his hometown of Jackson, Mississippi, kindled his love for storytelling. Kendall is both excited and grateful to be an eye, ear, and voice for those who call New York their home. When he's not reporting the news, he's recording music, working out, trying new food, or exploring a new part of town. If you see Kendall, feel free to say hello and connect with him on social media. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kendall.
Good evening, everybody. How y'all doing? Good. Thank you for answering that question. I was worried about, asking you guys that. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Again, I'm Kendall Green. I am from Jackson, Mississippi, and I have the pleasure of being a journalist. And what we do every day is we document humanity. We talk about all the issues that are right there in our face all the time. And a couple of stories involving the climate that you guys may remember or have seen lately. Just want you to raise your hand if you've seen it. How many of you guys have seen the Hudson Valley flooding about a month ago? How many of you saw the impact that it had on families? Their property just wiped away in a matter of minutes, hours. How many of you guys remember the orange sky here in New York? How many of you guys talked about that with your friends and your family, and you just kind of wonder what's going on here? That's the climate. That's where we're in. And the last example, New York, 2023, the smallest record of snowfall, 2.3 inches of snowfall here in New York. When I moved here about 6 months ago, I expected a real cold winter, and I haven't experienced it yet, but they predict next winter coming up, it's gonna be one of the most spring-like winters we've experienced. That's climate change. And first of all, I'm glad that you guys are in the room to talk about it. I'm glad you guys are in the room to hear solutions. And I'm thankful you guys trust me with being an MC here. And the science is evidence that we've got to do something. And I'm glad we have some professionals, experts who are doing the work. And it's a pleasure to be before you. So we're going to get to the program and introduce our president of the Harlem Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Lloyd Williams. Sir, we thank you for being here.
When I came in the lobby and I saw this massive line of people trying to navigate getting past a security guard who was a little dogmatic, to say the least, was frustrating, but it is part of, I guess, what they call government process with no manager and limited direction to those who work for them. But I'm hoping, of course, that as I looked at that massive line of people trying to get in, that they're able to navigate themselves up here before the weather changes today. We'll see how that works out, okay? Let me just mention briefly what this is about. The subject of climate change and its disproportionate negative impact on communities and nations of color is what we are focused on. We are concerned about that because too few people are concerned about that. And we recognize that oftentimes what is happening in unserviced communities and unserviced nations is being ignored. But when we talk about that, we have Peggy Shepard, who you'll hear from later on, who allows us to understand that although we are talking about Mississippi and we're talking about Florida and we're talking about New Orleans, we're talking about Jamaica and we're talking about Puerto Rico and we're talking about all of that and what's happening in Africa and all of that. Let's focus on what's happening in New York City, okay? And it becomes, to a large degree, the prototype for what's happening in urban cities across the nation. There are certain things that are incredible to understand. So let me just mention part of this. The vast majority of you, although many of you are too young to actually remember Hurricane Katrina, you know about Hurricane Katrina. And you know about the thousands of people who perished as the levees broke and went into particularly the 9th Ward of New Orleans, which is one of the poorest of the wards in America. Now, let me just give you a true piece on this. Dr. Boudreau and I have spoken about this. When we talk about the thousands of people who perished with Hurricane Katrina, the majority of them perished around a factor that most of us would not even consider. What is that factor? Lack of transportation. Lack of transportation. And so what happened in those wards is there was very little public transportation taking place, very little. And because most of the residents were poor, they did not have cars, okay? So they were unable to leave that ward. Now, you might think about that. You would never figure it out that so many of them died for lack of public transportation. One of the frightening stories about that, and this is a true story, hidden fact, things they don't talk about, is as many of the residents of the 9th Ward and other surrounding wards left and trekked for miles to get out of New Orleans, they came to this main bridge that connects the wards with the main city. And when they got to the bridge, they were turned back by state troopers with rifles, okay? When we talk about environmental justice, you'll understand some of that. Now, nobody ever speaks about that, but they were turned back. Why were they turned back? So that others more affluent could exit in their cars or however they were moving about. So we could talk about that. But then Peggy Shepard has been telling us for years about what's happening in our communities because of lack of trees, okay? Now we're starting to understand this better. Phoenix, Arizona, many of you know this, had 30 straight days of temperatures in excess of 120 degrees, okay? I'm sorry, in excess of 110 degrees, okay? And they finally broke that cycle because on the next day it went down to 108. So that's how people are living. But when you go to Phoenix, Arizona, and you see who's really being impacted, it is the indigenous, it is the poor, Hispanics, and it's the poor people of color disproportionately. They don't have air conditioning units, okay? And they're trying to survive. So in any event, let me just say this. We need to look. We know, of course, there are many people, you don't want to get too caught up in the Democrats versus the Republicans, but we do know that disproportionately the conservative Republicans are the ones who are saying that climate change is a hoax, okay? That's a liberal hoax. The same people who told us a couple of years ago when we got hit by COVID-19 in February, and it started to ravage our nation, there was very little concern about this because it was the urban cities and it was cities of color that were being devastated. The state of Florida was laughing. The governor was laughing, had press conferences saying that's a New York issue, okay? Until it took over Florida, okay? So you might recall, my wife tells me, Brian, that I can only refer to him as 45. Okay, so my wife tells me, I mean, literally, she almost forbids me to say the name. So she said 45. Okay. Now, I mean, if this was not true, it would be funny. I mean, what you're listening to. 45, you will recall, said to the American public, as COVID took over the nation in February, he told them in April, don't worry about it because the summer's coming. And when the summer comes, it's going to disappear like magic. Those were his words. And now millions of people later who have perished. So those are connecting linkages to why we're here today. And we are going to give you information that simply says communicate. We need to communicate with each other. They have us divided, okay? And we play into that. We're a different color. We speak a different language. We're different political parties. We have different religions. All of these reasons to prevent us from talking to each other. And as we talk to each other, we know that we have far more in common than we have that is not in common. And so, without further ado, let me just briefly tell you about Harlem Week. Harlem Week this year goes from today, our first actual day, although we started in July, our first day of Harlem Week. Our theme, please note our theme is Be the Change, that you can and you must be the change. Hope, joy, and love, be the change. So that's what we're encouraging you to do. You can be the change in your family. You can be the change on your block. You can be the change in your neighborhood. You can be the change because if you're not going to be the change, who will? Okay. Now, let me just give you quick connections on this. The adage, there's nothing new under the sun. Okay. So we came up with this theme. Our committee worked hard for weeks to come up with a theme. And we combined two thoughts, be the change, and there was another theme that said hope, joy, and love. And as we combined those to be the change, hope, joy, and love, we were so happy, Dr. Ramsey, that we came up with this theme, be the change. Everyone loved it. We received a call about 2 weeks later, okay? And our Lieutenant Governor, Antonio Delgado, has joined us. Sir, now listen to this, sir. So we be the change. Now we got this. We came up with this. This is so creative. Someone called us and said, and follow the dots here. They came up and said, did you know that that was the theme for the 1963 March on Washington? Okay, so you start thinking, Donna, that there's something new, but it was the theme for the 1963 March on Washington that we will be celebrating at the end of this month, the 60th anniversary. Okay, now just hear this. Many of you think that the theme for the March on Washington was I Have a Dream, right? That's what you hear. I Have a Dream was accidental. It was an accident. Dr. King was speaking about being the change. And this is a true story, so look into it. He was speaking about being the change. And the late, great Mahalia Jackson was sitting two chairs away. And Mahalia said, Martin, tell him about the dream. And so Martin, he's keep talking. And he talked again. And Mahalia said, Martin, tell him about the dream. And he continued. And the third time, Dr. Ramsey, she said, Martin, tell him about the dream. So what happened was, a few weeks earlier, she was at a church with Dr. King where he talked about, I have a dream. And she said, Martin, tell him what you said at the church. So that's where I Have a Dream came from, okay? Now, here's the end of it. So you hear the end of the story, and we move the program. So now, where did Martin Luther King get that from? Okay? Martin Luther King, as you will recall, those who are into history, was a disciple of Mahatma Gandhi. Okay? That's who he was a disciple of. Okay, the nonviolent aspect came from Mahatma. And what was Mahatma's theme in India? Be the change. And so sometimes you don't know that there is nothing new under the sun. Be the change from Mahatma, be the change from Martin, and now Harlem, we be the change, and I'm sure Mahatma got it from someone. So you have an opportunity to be here, and you have an opportunity to be the change. So take this information with you and convey it in moving forward, okay? Yes, I know his schedule. Thank you. Okay. No, this is my brother here. Brian heads up B Season, tremendous group that does such great work with us, and he tries to make sure we know exactly what's going on. Thank you. Yeah. Brian Dodson, give him a hand. B Season. Okay. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to go to our first speaker. He happens to be a great friend. He happens also to be the president of one of the most important educational institutions in America, the City College of New York. Let me introduce Dr. Vincent Boudreau. Dr. Boudreau.
Last year, when I spoke at this event, I told a story about international cooperation. I've got another story that's similar. It's not the same story, but it does rhyme. And there was a time in the 1970s and 1980s where people that studied international relations, they were concerned about this question of what is it that makes it possible for nations to cooperate with one another, because they mostly didn't. And one of the answers they came up with was an answer looking at the phenomenon of acid rain in the United States. You remember when acid rain was something we talked about, those factories along the Great Lakes in Cleveland and Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse were producing this acid rain that killed lakes and fishes all north and west. And what was happening was lakes in the Appalachians and in New England were dying, but lakes in Canada were dying as well, right? And so theorists looked at this and they said, this is an opportunity. It's terrible that it's happening, but it's an opportunity because we have an issue that doesn't respect boundaries, right? And when you have an issue that doesn't respect boundaries and it must be solved collaboratively, there's hopes that nations will work together. And there were two assumptions at the bottom of that theory, right? The first assumption was an assumption of mutual vulnerability. We would both be hurt by acid rain, right? Hear it. We'll both be hurt by climate change. We'll all be hurt by climate change. And the second is the inability to exit the situation, right? So Canada couldn't pack up and move someplace else. The United States couldn't pack up and move someplace else. We were stuck in that place with that phenomenon that was hurting us. And so, one of the subtitles of today's event references smoke and wildfire and extreme heat and extreme rainstorms, all of these things that at least some people are saying now climate change is undeniable. If you haven't paid attention to the statistics, if you haven't looked beneath the margin, or if you thought that this tornado or that hurricane or this heat wave just happened to be a little fluctuation, now look at what's happening globally. And you can't deny climate change. However, read the newspaper yesterday, and the Texas Education Department is funding 4 Texas elementary schools climate denial films, explaining that climate change is happening. It has nothing to do with us. We're not responsible. God is doing that. Mike Huckabee, former presidential candidate, proud father of Sarah Huckabee Sanders, has now a series of books that he's published, children's book of climate change. Same story, not us. This is God's plan for us, and we just have to live with it. But we can't stop it. We can't change it because we're not doing it. And so we're at this moment when, on the one hand, if you think about the lessons of acid rain, you should think this is a great opportunity for us to figure it out and work together. And if with acid rain, we were talking about different nations, with climate change, especially within the United States, we're talking about different communities within our nation, right? Lloyd was talking about the fact that people in those affected areas in New Orleans didn't have transportation and others did. And I suspect over the course of today's discussion, you will get lists and lists and lists of those kinds of differentials that make climate change more burdensome to under-resourced communities. I have a couple myself. Twice as many people of color live within a mile of a toxic waste site as white communities. 75%, African Americans are 75% more likely to live near what they call a fence line community. This is a community that borders petrochemical plants and strip malls and bus depots, like any of those industries that produce toxic waste. Twice as many children in communities of color are afflicted by asthma, which we know has everything to do with proximity to things like bus depots, than children in other communities. And you can go on and on and on, and we will hear more of this as the day goes on. But what is it in our current moment, despite what I would say the undeniable fact of climate change and its pervasive, undifferentiated potential impact on every community in the United States, makes it so hard for us to grab onto the reality that this is something that we have to cooperate around. And I would say we go back to those same two preconditions that made the original theorizing around acid rain possible. Mutual vulnerability. Are our populations mutually vulnerable? No, they are not. And do we have a situation in which it is impossible for everyone to exit the situation? And the answer is no, we do not. We have a situation in which the historic transmission of inequality and oppression and trauma means that we have tremendous vulnerability in communities of color. And the historic transmission of privilege and the way current policies interact with that privilege means that for all intents and purposes, wealthy communities, like the people that were allowed to cross the bridge in their cars, can exit the situation. So let me just give you a little taste of that. A study by Rice University and University of Pittsburgh looked at communities affected by natural disaster, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, that kind of impact. Now, again, you would think that if a hurricane comes and crosses Florida, it's going to cross rich communities and poor communities, and it does. They looked at communities that had suffered more than $10 billion of damage. And what they discovered is at a household level, African-American homeowners, over the course of that $10 billion natural disaster, suffered a $19,000 decrease in family wealth. White homeowners, and we're controlling for wealth, right? We're saying white homeowners who own a $400,000 house or a $100,000 house, white homeowners on average experienced a wealth increase of $126,000. So in the way that we are recovering from natural disaster, in the way that we are going back into a devastated community and deciding which communities are worth investing in, we're making racial decisions about where our money should go. FEMA has a buyout program, and one of the things that we're seeing with climate change and the rise of ocean levels is we're seeing that more and more houses are becoming vulnerable to being inundated by oceans. And we've probably all been following the fact that in California and Florida and elsewhere, insurance companies are no longer insuring houses, right? You can't build a new house in California and expect most of the big insurance companies to insure it because they're not going to make money. That house is likely to be at some point scrapped. But what we found, looking at the communities and the households that were eligible for those FEMA programs, they were 90% houses that cost more than $400,000. Meaning that this is a program that, if not in the way it was written, in the way it was implemented, had nothing to do with vulnerable communities, and that means communities of color in these places. We know about the wildfires in California and how dangerous they have become. One of the ways that we have set about trying to mitigate the possibility of wildfires in some of these communities is to take telephone poles, wooden telephone poles, and power lines where sparks sometimes are generated and bury those lines underground. And that makes them immeasurably safer. Guess what? That's an expensive proposition. And it's typically funded not by the state government, the federal government, but by property taxes in the neighborhood. So here again, the pre-existing transmission of privilege underwrites the ability of one community to exit the relationship they have with other communities, with our communities, around questions of, can we figure out together what we're going to do about climate change, how we're going to protect ourselves from climate change. And then you look a little bit more deeply into this, and you look at the statistics of people that are applying for dual citizenship in places that they believe are going to be safe from climate change, I guarantee you, there's a portion of this society that is planning to figure out where they're going to go when they can no longer collaborate as a full, differentiated society around solving these problems. And it's not Harlem, and it's not Watts, and it's not vulnerable communities along the Gulf of Mexico that are making those decisions, or they're able to make those decisions. So where does that leave us? It leaves us, I think, with a technological problem that we need to solve, all the technological problems around climate change. But increasingly, we're moving from how do we prevent this thing to a recognition that mitigation and restoration and reinvestment and reimagining of what it means to live on this planet is shaping how we're going to get through these next several decades. So what does that mean for us politically? We must identify the ways that communities are exiting the social contract in this society and do everything we can to prevent it. We need to identify the differential impact of policies that look like they're colorblind, that look like they're just technological solutions like burying telephone lines or figuring out where it makes the most economic sense to reinvest in a community that's been devastated by a natural disaster. We need to unearth the inequality in those. And we need to recognize all the different ways, and I'm sure we're going to hear about them over the course of this discussion, all the different ways in which the transmitted vulnerabilities of our society, transmitted over the last 300 years, are absolutely indicators of vulnerability in the face of climate change. President Ramsey and Ade know this from our conversation last night, but I spent a couple of days last week, 2 weeks ago, down at the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And what is so clear in that museum, in that presentation of the uninterrupted legacy, traumatic legacy of slavery through lease slavery, through lynching, through Jim Crow, through mass incarceration, every step of the way, that people of color in this nation are rendered vulnerable by their history. And that needs to be recognized in how we approach climate change. So is it too late to prevent climate change? I don't know if that's the case. Every day I read about new ideas to try to mitigate the effects of climate change to prevent it from happening. But we are far past the point where we think we can get back to where we were 50 years ago in ways that are going to shield our children and our grandchildren from the effects of climate change. And if that's the case, then we need to re-cement the bounds of our community, prevent exit from the social contract, and recognize the differential impact of the policies that are set up to remediate against climate change. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I deeply appreciate. And I deeply appreciate the efforts of Mr. Williams and the Harlem Chamber of Commerce in convening this conversation, because it is probably the most important conversation we're going to have. Thank you.
I'm glad you got some of the people in. I feel for you who are on those long lines, but I do appreciate being patient, and I hope and expect that it will be rewarded by the information you get out of this conference and what you bring to the conference. Thank you. We look at our communities, particularly the urban communities, and you see the preponderance of buses and trucks and trains and cars going through our communities. I recall, and Dan really knows these things better than others, when it was shared, Dan, with us that we in New York City, in the main, Daniel Patterson, that there are we experience approximately 11 earthquakes per year without even knowing it. Okay? Much of it is the noise, it's the trains, it's what's happening around. So what is that doing our system and to our mentality? But as we talk about that, if you don't want to believe in climate change, ask the polar bears. Okay? Have you seen this in terms of the loss of ice and how many of them are now no longer have a place to go and are dying? There's a connecting linkage between what's taking place. And we have an opportunity to impact on that. Let me just mention before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to ask Dr. Ramsey to stand up, please. Okay? Please stay right there, don't sit. I invite you all, do yourself a favor and look up Dr. Patricia Ramsey, the president of Medgar Evers College, one of the most brilliant educators in this country, but also look at her research background. Look at what she studied, where she studied it. And I say that to you because I tell you, Patricia, you're my sister. I tell you how much I love and appreciate you. And the fact that you came out to be with us to listen to this is you honor us by your presence. I just wanted to thank you. I also want to say that the messaging that you're hearing today, at this moment, thousands of others are hearing this exact message. This is being live streamed. And so there are thousands of others hearing this as we speak. And there are tens of thousands who will be able to connect with this later and over the next few weeks. So just know it is being live streamed. Let me then introduce our next speaker. I very much want you to know him because I've been pushing him, and he didn't need a heavy push, to get better known, particularly in New York City, and particularly in the communities of color of New York City and New York State. Because when we hear and look at some of these elected officials today, and we try to figure out, what's wrong with them. Where the hell are they coming from? How could you think like that? It is important to meet an elected official who is different. Hey, Mitch, that's DJ Mitch. Let me tell you, I'm gonna give you a great connection. Our lieutenant governor was himself a DJ. So that tells you all automatically he's different. He was a DJ, a father, and very, very concerned, former congressman. And I want you to know him because tomorrow's not guaranteed for any of us. But as the days go by, I will share with you that you will remember his name and that he is now the lieutenant governor of the state of New York. But there's more to come. So without further ado, please do recognize the lieutenant governor of the state of New York, Antonio Delgado. Mr. DJ.
Good evening. Brother Lloyd Williams, thank you for the very kind introductions. point of clarification, especially because we are celebrating 50 years of hip hop. MC.
My son loved that.
Just to be clear. It's interesting too, well, let me first just acknowledge the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce and all of the good people who are pulling this together in Harlem Week, and the important emphasis on climate. As I'm sitting, listening, trying to piece together some of the things that have been shared already, from Be the Change to the transmission of vulnerabilities as detailed by the doctor, otherwise known as the legacy of hate, racism, systemic oppression, from slavery to the Black codes, to as recently as redlining in the 60s, which, by the way, created a lot of the neighborhoods that are disproportionately experiencing pollution. I kept wrestling with this idea of change and what creates change. How do you make change? Well, the key ingredient to making change is to first understand what we're changing from. There has to be an agreement on what is the case, an objective set of facts. Climate change is real. That would be one fact. Another fact, there's no redeeming qualities born of the institution of chattel slavery. Another fact. Truth is in short supply. And as noted by Lloyd, a lot of folks that call themselves leaders in these days have no problem peddling falsehoods and utilizing the echo chambers of manipulation and misinformation that are abundant throughout society to exploit our vulnerabilities and to play on people's fears and their anxieties. And it is incumbent that we speak truth to power, that we communicate what is the case and never relent. And if we do not do that, then the status quo remains. And of course, those who have been historically marginalized and underserved and forgotten disproportionately feel the effects of not acknowledging truth. And truth, and our commitment to truth, I would argue, I believe Dr. King would argue, and I would believe Gandhi would argue, all stems from love. The recognition that each of us are anchored in love, that each of us has this innate, infinite power that gives dignity to our shared humanity, and that power is more natural than anything else. Hate, as Nelson Mandela would talk about, has to be taught. No one is born hating, but we are born loving. And so it is incumbent upon us to cultivate that and to speak truth in a way that anchors us in that universal truth. Now, I was brought here to speak a little bit about climate and environmental justice, but I thought it was important to put the substance in proper context. And that is how I am orienting myself when I think about climate change. And when I think about environmental justice, it has to come from a place of love, a place of compassion, a place of, as alluded to, mutuality. We have to embrace our sense of connectivity in the first place. And if we don't do that, then we remain at a standstill. And so make no mistake about it that when we have divisive forces who make it their business to prey upon truth, they're really preying upon our values. They're really preying upon our capacity to bond and to make change, or to live out that dream that Dr. King so eloquently articulated. So we know what lies ahead, but it's also important to know how we got here. And these were policy choices that resulted in Black and brown communities being disproportionately impacted, from food deserts to a lack of green spaces to the destruction of an interstate through the center of a community. These didn't just materialize organically. These were intentional choices rooted in the legacy of dehumanizing an entire race of people. That's the truth. And we have to be able to wrestle with that truth earnestly and genuinely, and especially here in New York, when you think about what's going on around the rest of the country. This state is certainly committed to righting the wrongs of the past, which means you have to know what those wrongs are and state them clearly so people understand and have agreed upon sense of truth, ensuring that we deal with climate in a way that reflects those tragedies and that seeks to right them. The nation-leading 2019 CLCPA requires 35%, at least 40% of the benefits and the investments that go to meet our climate goals go towards disadvantaged communities. That's a policy decision. We want to invest in attacking climate change and create opportunity and growth and heal communities. And we want to make sure that a significant percentage is tied to a community or communities that have been marginalized and underserved. Policy changes that are designed to rectify changes or decisions from the past. We're also ensuring that all state agencies and authorities prioritize disadvantaged communities in their various policies and programs when it comes to reducing air pollution and climate-altering greenhouse gas emissions. New York also has surpassed 100 certified climate-smart communities across the state, a program that through New York State Department of Environmental Conservation helps local governments take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change. The budget includes support for New York's burdened with high electric bills, invest a record $400 million into the Environmental Protection Fund, millions in the funding for clean water infrastructure in New York state parks. And we are proud that NYSERDA's NYC Clean Energy Hub, a team of trusted, knowledgeable, and community-based organizations, are coming together to figure out ways to develop more clean energy, clean efficiency, workforce, and economic development practices. These are steps, and these are positive steps the state is taking to move us in the right direction. But more steps are certainly required. And in making those steps, I just want to make it clear to all of you that myself and the governor understand from whence we are come and where we are trying to go. And if we are really going to make change, if we are really going to do the heavy lifting of solving for very complicated issues like climate change and like systemic racism, we got to be honest and we got to be truthful. And I say this not to judge, not to blame, not to point fingers, but in the spirit of dialogue, in the spirit of communication, in the spirit of understanding that truth and reconciliation is required. And I think that we have reached a tipping point in our country where their collective unconscious, I think, recognizes that's where we are. And either you can react to that out of fear or anxiety when you look at the demographics and how they're changing, becoming more of a majority minority country, or we can be inspired by where we're headed, a multiracial, multicultural, evolving democracy the world has never known. We can celebrate that, but it takes real leadership, and it takes real truth-telling, and it takes a commitment from all of us in this room. So I want to just say thank you for the opportunity to communicate with you, to be with you. I wish I could stay for the panel. I know it's going to be a wonderful conversation, but do know that with myself and with the governor, you have state actors here who understand the history and are dedicated to making sure that we move forward in the right direction and ground that conversation in the right way. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Let me move the agenda. Couple of Harlem Week updates. There are 3 main days of Harlem Week, so I'll just address those dates. The 13th of August, which is this Sunday. It is called A Great Day in Harlem. And that is taking place from 1 p.m. until 8 p.m. at U.S. Grant National Memorial Park. Hundreds of vendors and exhibitors. We have a gospel caravan segment headed up by the great gospel superstar, Bishop Hezekiah Walker. We have plays that will have segments. Hadestown is one of those, and 2 other Broadway plays that will perform. But each of our days, we have a tribute. And on Sunday the 13th, at A Great Day of Harlem, we're honoring the late, great Tina Turner. And so there will be a major tribute to Tina Turner that is put together by the fabulous Ray Chew, the musician to the stars. And amongst the artists performing is R&B Hall of Fame great Nona Hendrix in tribute to Tina Turner and other superstars. Then we go to the next major date. That is the 19th, of August, the following weekend, Saturday the 19th. We are at that point on West 135th Street from 5th Avenue to St. Nicholas Avenue. On that day, we will have 3 stages of entertainment. One is the Children's Festival that is taking place on that day for children from 5 years of age to 12. And they will come and they will get information on education. They will get gifts, they will get books, they will get things to go back to school with, etc. at the Children's Festival, games and rides, etc. There's also a St. Nicholas Avenue stage that will celebrate the 50th anniversary of hip hop. That is very important to our communities, with great artists performing, multiple tributes taking place on that day. You will be hearing about some of the artists performing. There will also be plays on that day. MJ the Musical will be one of them. The Wiz will be taking place, many of them live performances taking place on that day. And then at 5th Avenue, we will feature the great Stephanie Mills, and she will be coming up for a live performance on that date. And there's so many other things taking place, like the Alex Trebek Harlem Children's Spelling Bee at Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Alex Trebek was a member of our chamber. He supported all of our children's programming. And so we always want to remember the greatness amongst us. The final major day is also on 135th Street, from 5th Avenue to St. Nicholas. On that day, there are 4 stages of entertainment. There is the Children's Festival. Again, it's a 2-day event. Then there is the 5th Avenue stage. On that day, we will be giving salutes to hip hop legend Heavy D, and there will be a number of the great hip hop artists who are coming out, Hip Hop Hall of Fame Museum, etc. All of them are coming out for that day. Between Malcolm X and Adam Powell, there's what we call the center stage, and that's our cultural stage. And you will have at least 6 plays, Early Victorious, that will be there. so many other plays coming out on that day, on that stage. And then we go to our St. Nicholas stage. And the entire day, I'll close on this, at St. Nicholas, we'll do a major tribute to Harry Belafonte. And the entire day on 135th Street is honoring Harry Belafonte and his family. Some of you asked when Harry Belafonte passed away, how come there was no major program for him at St. Patrick's Cathedral or at Riverside Church? Because Harry Belafonte, who was one of the founders of Harlem Week, insisted that that not happen when he passed away. He said, I want to celebrate with the community. And so his family has come together and they're saying, let's make that day a tribute to Harry Belafonte. So there will be a New York City tribute from the mayor, a New York State tribute from the governor, congressional tributes, and all of those things will be happening. But why 135th Street? We were on that block anyway. But you should know Harry Belafonte was born on 135th Street at Harlem Hospital. Harry Belafonte started his career on 135th Street at the American Negro Theater Company with Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, and Sidney Poitier. And many of you know that Harry Belafonte is the patron of Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. So there could not be a greater place. There are some artists that I am not allowed, based on Marco Noble's direction, to tell you about. So I did not say that Mary J. Blige will be there. You did not hear that from me, okay? And if any of you tell Marco I said it, I will deny it, okay? So, oh, you're reminding me about that. Oh, you're terrible. So let's move the agenda. Let's go to the next thing. Let me ask if the panel will come up. The subject is the negative impact of climate change on the Harlem community. The moderator is our friend and associate for the past 3 years, Daniel Zarilli, who's a special advisor for climate and sustainability at Columbia University. Dan will introduce the rest of his panelists to you. And then after they speak, and that's going to be, you're going to get so much info. You're going to then hear from the extraordinary Peggy Shepard, okay? What has happened with the focus on urban America and climate change. Peggy Shepard, more than anyone, is responsible for that focus. Peggy will speak, and then you're going to hear something that is terribly important, environmental justice. The panel on environmental justice, headed up by one of the most brilliant jurists in America, Judge Milton Tingling, and he will introduce his panel. So without further ado, Dan, I go to you. If you'd introduce your panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lloyd, for that introduction. It's just a great pleasure to be here on behalf of the Columbia Climate School. This partnership over the last 2 or 3 years with the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce has been just so productive. We've run now, this is the fourth in a series of events where we've heard about the issues happening in Harlem, the solutions that are being driven in Harlem, and we've seen the elected officials and community leaders come together really to point our way forward on this great challenge. And I really want to thank Lloyd, his entire team, for their leadership on this issue. And it's just a great pleasure to be here to help kick off Harlem Week this year. I am joined to my left by Dr. Robbie Parks. He's an assistant professor of environmental health sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. He's an environmental epidemiologist focused on climate-related exposures, public health, and equity, and has been doing amazing research in this community that you're going to hear about today. And to his left is Tasfiya Naim. the chief of staff at the Five Borough Institute, which I'll let her describe. A little disclosure, I serve on the board of the Five Borough Institute. It's a wonderful new organization helping the city think through new policy initiatives. Before that, Antaspia and I knew each other when she worked in the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate Policy and Programs, overseeing a range of initiatives on climate and environmental justice. My name is Dan Zarilli. I'm a special advisor at Columbia University, special advisor for climate and sustainability. I also served as New York City's chief climate policy advisor for a number of years under Mayor de Blasio, where we invested billions of dollars in climate protections, divested 3 of the city's pension funds from fossil fuels, and enacted important legislation like Local Law 97, which you may have heard about, mandatory building retrofits in the city, and most importantly for this event, Local Laws 60 and 64 of 2017, which is the city's groundbreaking environmental justice legislation, working, of course, alongside leaders such as Peggy Shepard at We Act, who you'll hear from after this panel. The policy landscape in this city and state and nation are dramatically changed on issues of climate and environmental justice, whether it's the legislation that happening here in New York City, the CLCPA, which the Lieutenant Governor mentioned, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the passage of the $4.2 billion State Bond Act, which was a hot topic at last year's Harlem Week event, which subsequently passed, and is helping drive investment into the state-defined disadvantaged communities, as well as then the Inflation Reduction Act, which has unlocked billions and billions of dollars of investment into clean energy, renewable energy, retrofits, energy efficiency, all manner of technologies that are going to help us get out of this. But as the events of this summer are showing us, it's just, we need to do so much more, as the Lieutenant Governor just said. Last week, over 170 million Americans were under heat advisories. Cities like Phoenix and Austin, all across the South and Southwest, seeing record-breaking streaks of triple-digit heat. Floods have been ravaging upstate New York, Vermont, the Canadian wildfire, of course, that gave us this city's worst air quality in decades, since the passage of the Clean Air Act, in fact, showing you the benefits of regulation in this area, but how climate change is undoing the gains that we've seen in air quality. And then the ocean was over 100 degrees in Florida, record high temperatures across the whole North Atlantic, record low sea ice extents in Antarctica. If you're seeing all this news and thinking something's happening, something is changing, you're absolutely right. These are the consequences of continuing to put heat trapping gases into our atmosphere. These are the consequences of continuing to burn coal, oil, and gas. And this is, of course, driving so many of these impacts. But the important thing about the impacts that we're seeing is that, yes, we're all vulnerable. We're all seeing the effects of this. But as you've heard so eloquently, these effects are not felt equally. The time and time again, we are reminded that certain communities are disproportionately feeling these burdens, and it's typically those communities that have contributed the least to this problem. The legacy of segregation, redlining, racism, contributing to all of this and just continuing to show up in this injustice. So that's what we're here to talk about today, and we've got 2 great panelists here to help shed some additional light on what's happening here in our city, in our community, in Harlem. And let me first turn to Dr. Parks. Again, Assistant Professor of Environmental Health Sciences at Columbia. You're watching what's happening around the globe. You're also studying what it means for us in this community. Why don't you give the audience here just a flavor of the kind of research you do and what you've been seeing happening and how it impacts this community.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and thanks for the introduction. Just like to say very much thank you to the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, and it's such an honor to be part of a fantastic event like this, and as part of Harlem Week. So, a lot of the research I work on and think about is how climate change impacts, every element of our health and our well-being. Now, of course, we need no reminder for this summer in particular, but generally this year, that, you just need to believe your eyes, really. We need to believe our eyes. We see the skies orange. We feel the heat. We know here that climate change and climate-related dangers are very real. But just moving beyond the things which we can see with our eyes, are sometimes the statistics that we sometimes need to collect before we can understand what's going on from an equity lens or from a sort of deeper lens. And one such statistic is that, you know, Black New Yorkers are more than twice as likely to die from heat-related conditions than white New Yorkers. Now, I appreciate the Lieutenant Governor talking about facts, because that is a fact. Now, if you believe that fact, do we accept that that is just the way it has to be? Or do we start to think about the ways in which that is the case right now? And so part of my research is to try and understand the drivers and the differences between those kind of things. Now, you can look around your community, but largely, you know, with regards to inequity, you can start at home, and you can start at the way in which people generate electricity, the reliability of electricity, what people eat, what people are given as choices to eat. And so, for example, the way people cook, the way people use gas, when we know that people like induction cookers, the way people stay cool in the summer, it's seen as a luxury for some reason to stay cool in the summer, where we know that it isn't a luxury. We know it's essential to life. People living with conditions, you know, people are living with cardiovascular health disabilities and you know, diabetes. All of those pull in the same direction, and all of those lead to that statistic that Black New Yorkers are more than twice as likely to die from heat-related conditions than white New Yorkers. And so so part of my research, just to summarize, Dan, is really to try and understand why that is. I mean, if we just say, okay, that's a fact, and it is a fact, do we just accept that? Or do we try and look at the reasons why, both short to long term, that is the case? And that's sort of part of what really interests me. And as you look at it, you quickly see the levers are there to affect change. So, you know, why are power cuts so disproportionately in communities who are poorer and people of color, et cetera, et cetera. It just goes on and on. And so that's really how my research is.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Tasfia, I'll let you maybe say a little bit more about Five Borough and the work you do, but you've been recently releasing recommendations for the city on how to think about these challenges, wildfires, heat in particular. Why don't you give the audience a little sense of where that's going and you know the challenges on addressing these types of conditions that Robbie just laid out.
Sure. So everyone, as Dan mentioned, I'm Tasfia Naeem. Like Robbie, it's a total honor to be a part of Harlem Week. Thanks to the Chamber for having me. So I am the Chief of Staff of the Five Borough Institute. We are a brand new think tank working to tackle New York City's largest challenges. And the way that we seek to do that is we seek to import smart ideas from businesses, from academia, from nonprofits, from other cities, other states, and bring them into New York City. So we try to work to find actionable roadmaps and real plans to help bring those ideas to New York to improve the city that we love. And we have a powerhouse board, including Dan, including Judge Tingling, who's moderating the next panel, folks who really know how to enact change in New York and what it takes for policies to move forward. And that's what we're aiming to do. And so given our mission is solving New York City's largest problems, you cannot do that without addressing climate change. And that's why over the past several months, we've been working on a number of issues related to climate in New York City, from resiliency and air quality to extreme heat. I'll focus a little bit on extreme heat. Like Robin mentioned just now, heat really is, like many climate impacts, convergence of multiple crises at once. It is an equity crisis. Black New Yorkers are twice as likely to die from extreme heat than white New Yorkers. It is a health crisis. The heat wave last week resulted in a 300% spike in ER visits related to heat-related illnesses. And it's also a climate crisis. Currently, we have 18 days over 90 degrees in New York City on average in a given year. And the New York City Panel on Climate Change predicts that that number is going to increase from 18 to 75 days per year above 90 degrees by the year 2080 under the worst circumstances. And so first and foremost, so what our group has been doing is working to address a lot of these issues. And number one, as always, our recommendation to the city is to achieve carbon neutrality and really take climate action, because by taking climate action, you can stave off the worst impacts of the climate crisis and really protect future generations. But we also have a lot of recommendations that the city can implement today, because we also need to respond to the impacts that we're experiencing today and that we're seeing and New Yorkers are experiencing. And so we are actually releasing next week a paper on extreme heat recommendations. So y'all are going to get a sneak preview of some of our recommendations today, but it includes things from short-term, immediate, like slam dunk solutions that the city could dispatch in, a couple of weeks. And some of those are just very common sense solutions. Like, we didn't have to have a 300% spike in ER visits last week related to heat. Some of the things that the city could do is really target folks who are vulnerable at the places where they are vulnerable. Folks are vulnerable when they're outside, exposed to heat for extended periods of time, when they're working outside, et cetera. One of the places that New Yorkers can be in where they are more vulnerable is just taking our transit system. Subways are hotter than surface temperatures in a lot of cases, and a lot of our buses don't have sufficient seating or don't have sufficient shading. There just aren't enough, if there's any at all. And so some common sense solutions could be deploying like water stations at some of these transit hubs, because fighting dehydration is one way to keep folks out of the ER and make sure that they're staying healthy. Another potential solution is public shading. Shading doesn't have to be a big, expensive solution. We've been seeing this in Portugal, for example, where the city hung up strings of umbrellas in rainbow colors over a crowded street that is known to have a lot of activity, but also really high temperatures. And so it increases the vibrancy of that street. The businesses all love it. Folks like to come to it because it's like an art installation now, but it also provides very significant shading benefits. When you provide shade like this, it can lower temperature, or the body feel temperature, from 20 to 40 degrees. So it does make a huge impact. And then we also do recommend longer term solutions that the city will need to invest in to see solutions. So, for example, one is with cooling centers. The city has a cooling center program where during extreme heat events, you can go to a library or a senior center, designated places throughout the city where you know that there's going to be cooling and you can go there, hang out. But there are issues with it. A study done by REACT actually found that of the cooling centers that they surveyed, a quarter didn't offer water, or half didn't offer food. And that is a real challenge. And so the city could work to expand their programs and also increase the reach of it, because a lot of heat vulnerable neighborhoods across the city still don't have access to the cooling centers the same way that other heat vulnerable neighborhoods do. We could also think more creatively about what cooling centers actually mean. So it doesn't just need to be a public facility. How can we turn places that New Yorkers are already going into cooling centers? There are a lot of folks who might feel comfortable, or when there's something happening, they might convene at their church, or they might convene at their mosque, or there are folks who are vulnerable who might regularly go to a soup kitchen. Can the city do things like offer small investments to help turn those places into cooling centers so that we can expand the number of places that New Yorkers can go to find relief during extreme heat? So it can include providing ACs, like grants for ACs, or even grants for installing a small kitchen. So in an extreme weather event or an extreme heat event, you can now cook food to serve your community. So just really thinking more broadly and more creatively about what resilience means, what does a resilient community mean, instead of thinking within one lane of this is a cooling center, we must expand it, but really thinking about what the community needs are and what the community assets are that we can enhance.
Thanks, Tasfia. I think it's so important to focus on this issue. The differentials are real. Heat also kills more New Yorkers, more Americans than any other natural hazard. This is something that's only going to get worse, and I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate the risk the same way that they look at the risk from a storm, a hurricane, a tornado. People who die in heat die alone. They die silently in ways that is not fully appreciated. So I appreciate the common sense solutions. So many of the solutions on heat, and it's like, we need to plant more trees. Yes, we all need to plant more trees. It takes decades for trees to mature to provide the shade and provide some of the benefits that we need. And some of the things you're talking about are like in the here and now, how to protect people. Robbie, back to you. I think your work on heat vulnerability and cooling. How do you look at that short-term versus long-term need of managing vulnerability, and what is your work showing us on this?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think, again, to reference the Lieutenant Governor, I think the word that I would think of as the operative word with this is dignity. I think that dignity should be at the forefront of the way that people stay cool in an elevated heat environment. And so when I think of the ways that I want to stay cool, I think cooling centers are important in a certain sense, but when it's a really hot day, I want to stay at home and be cool. And so how do we stay at home with dignity and being able to have all the things that we need? I've found that in surveys, people would much rather stay at home with functioning AC and be able to go about their day at home if they are able to stay at home. And so that's one thing I would add to the conversation is, how do we achieve dignity? A good friend of mine told me that she was on a bus yesterday and talking to someone about how they stay cool, and no judgment on the way this has been done, but they say that they sort of wet their clothes before they go to bed. Now I'm not going to judge that, but I know that many people probably wouldn't want to do that before they go to bed, so that they can get a good night's sleep. And so really, I just keep going back to the word dignity and how dignity is important, because we can, tell everyone to go to the mall and just stay there until it gets cool again. For me, that I would prefer to stay at home, and I think maybe a lot of people might agree with me that might be a good thing to do. Maybe have a balcony, maybe have a nice view that you'd like to stay in, and maybe you'd like to hang out with your family in the privacy of your own home. And so how does that happen? That happens with adequate cooling. What is adequate cooling? It's reliable, affordable electricity. It's AC units. Now, of course, the city has done more and more in the past few years to try and supply those AC units. But how do we supply the electricity at an affordable rate? That's an open question, of course. And so, those are the kind of solutions which are joined up between dignity and reality and climate change. So that's what I would sort of think about there.
Yeah, and I guess to add to that, one of the things that we also talk about in our forthcoming paper is universal cooling standard. So really thinking about how do you expand access to cooling in people's homes. So in New York City, if you're a resident, a tenant, your landlord has to make sure that in the winter, your apartment doesn't go below 62 degrees. What if the city then expands to that policy to, in the summer, your landlord also has to guarantee that your apartment doesn't go above 86 degrees, which is a policy that's being enacted in Phoenix, in Dallas, in even as close as Maryland. And so there are solutions that would be complicated. That's going to be a tough battle. That's not an easy solution that the city could instantaneously deploy where everyone's going to be super on board and excited. But there are tough battles that the city could take in order to bring more cooling options and more heat resiliency options to people, not just out in the street, out in their communities, but also to their homes.
Yeah, I think That's a great point, Sophia. And I think, if we think about these record-breaking triple-digit numbers, they're usually referring to outdoor temperatures. Whereas if you have, one of the current projects we're working on is, trying to at large measure what's going on indoors, because that's where we spend 80% of our time. We spend 80% in the United States, we spend 80% of our time indoors. So we talk about these triple digits. Let's think about the way we're experiencing heat indoors as well, because then we start realizing some of those limits of acceptability will probably change. Like if we knew that maybe indoors could be 90, 95 Fahrenheit, that's not sort of room temperature, as they call it. Think of room temperature, it literally should be that temperature because it's a room, so 70 Fahrenheit. So I'll just add that, I totally agree. Yeah.
And incredibly powerful. I think this idea that heat standards and cooling standards are not equalized in our city, in our society, and it's something that we're going to need to start demanding more of our elected officials. I think through this, to your point, the real estate industry and others may not necessarily be thrilled by some of these proposals, but it's going to get necessary. I think I just got a cue on a few last minutes that we've got here, but I wanted to, what we're talking about here, and a really interesting example of people cooling their clothes before they're going to bed. It's this idea of we're already adapting to the risks of climate change. We're already having to change our behaviors, but eventually we run into limits to doing that. And I'm curious where you think some of those limits really live, because we're going to keep making the world warmer. It's that's the sort of impacts are locked in, and eventually you lose the ability to adapt. I know some of your work has been looking at this question in particular. What do those limits look like? In particular, what do those look like here in Harlem?
The limits to adaptability, I think, is really important to think about, because when we think of AC units, obviously they are short-term solutions, but we're talking about long-term solutions. Ultimately, of course, mitigation of climate change is what we want to do, but how does that help us right now? And so really the lever is public health for me, because when we think about the idea of limits of adaptability, a lot of my research is to do with how it affects our mental health and our sense of self and our well-being. And we quickly find that when little pigeon steps away from the way we want our lives to be, suddenly being told, okay, you can't be at home because it's too hot. You have to go and do something you wouldn't otherwise have done. Okay, your house is flooded temporarily. It's going to be fixed. Maybe if you can get insurance payouts from FEMA and other places, maybe you can't. Okay, you have to move because there's a managed retreat taking place in your community, or everyone is suffering or has chronic health issues from climate-related dangers. And so these little steps away from where we want to be, really the idea of loss and damage, and I was at the UN COP conference last winter, and really that is a key element of the ways that we reach the limits to adaptability. I just want people to leave thinking about how it impacts the sense of self and sense of dignity again. And I think that really is the lasting damage that I think is happening. Like when our communities feel like they're no longer the communities we grew up with because of forces like heat, invisible killers out of our control. That's what I sort of think is really important to think about here.
Must be a last thought here.
I guess just to build on what Robbie shared, it is just so critically important to also invest in climate solutions. I feel like we think of climate solutions and we think, okay, these are things that we're going to see the benefits of in 2050 or 2060, but there are climate solutions that if we invested in this year, we could see the benefits in this year. That includes planting street trees, that includes investing in our buses, that includes creating more sustainable transportation infrastructure. There's just so many climate solutions that we could be implementing today. We just need the ambition and the commitment to invest in them. And so these climate benefits are so important long-term, but they also could help us today, and they will clean our air. If we improve our electricity system, our transportation system, if we get off the fossil fuels, we're experiencing those benefits almost immediately from the reduced air pollution that's coming in. And so there are just so many benefits that we could get. And so it's critically important to invest in them this year.
And to connect this back even more directly to the overall theme here, I think, the issues of making sure we're doing those investments and doing it in a way that helps redress these environmental injustices that have occurred. A few years ago, the city had a program called NYC Cool Neighborhoods, looking at heat exposure and ways in which it can mitigate that. But it did so through an equity lens, thinking about where do we have those biggest problems, and looking at heat vulnerability across the city, which largely is driven by many of the historic redlining and segregation concerns, issues of poverty, race and income end up being such a proxy for so many of the things that are wrong in this city. And so the city government at that time said, well, we're going to invest in street trees, but we're going to do it first in areas of high heat vulnerability. We're going to do it in communities like Central Brooklyn, Northern Manhattan, the South Bronx. We're going to continue to paint roofs white. We're going to do it in ways in these communities that have historically seen so much of this disinvestment. Taking that approach to saying, we're going to solve this problem, but we're going to solve it in a way that helps address those health and wealth inequities that we see in our society, I think is such an important and powerful lesson on how to make sure that these lessons, these investments go to overcome those disproportionate burdens that we have seen in our society, and that climate change is just exacerbating and making even worse. We're going to hear from Peggy Shepard next. We're going to hear on the next panel from a member of the administration and hear their thoughts as well on how some of this work is continuing to play out. But it's been my pleasure to moderate this panel. I want to thank Ravi and Tasfia for participating in this. Thank you both. And I'm going to hand this back over to Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you to panelists. Please give them another round of applause. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, the renowned Peggy Shepard. And so Peggy, I will not go over to your entire bio. It's just very distinguished. But I do want to highlight some points. Peggy is co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice. And this organization has a long history through Peggy's leadership of organizing and engaging, it says Northern Manhattan residents, I would say national, it's across the entire nation, in community-based planning and campaigns to address environmental protection and environmental health policy, as I said before, nationally and locally. She has successfully combined grassroots organizing, environmental advocacy, and environmental health community-based participatory research to become a national leader in advancing environmental policy and the perspective of environmental justice, particularly in urban communities. Her work has received broad recognition. This includes the Jane Jacobs Medal from the Rockefeller Foundation for Lifetime Achievement, the 10th Annual Heinz Award for the Environment, the William K. Riley Award for Environmental Leadership, and among many others. She's also received the Knight of the National Order of Merit from the French Republic. And needless to say, Peggy is just a special person and one of the most leading advocates nationally and internationally on climate change. So Peggy, it's a pleasure and a delight and a special privilege to have you here tonight.
Wow. Good evening, everybody. Wow, it's so great to see this room packed. And it's so great that for the first time, environmental justice has been discussed and defined without me having to do it. That's progress. And so I really want to thank Lloyd Williams for taking on the climate change challenge to make this issue so visible in the Harlem community. Thank you so much, Lloyd. Next year, but with a little more progress. So let me say that we really can't have climate justice without environmental justice. And Harlem is an environmental justice community that's been impacted by so many issues, whether it's sewage treatment plants, whether it's housing 1/3 of New York City's bus fleet in uptown neighborhoods, whether it's buses and trucks, whether it's the 80% of carbon coming from buildings. We are on the front lines of environmental justice. So again, we understand that extreme heat is also an important environmental justice issue, and I'm going to talk about why. We certainly know that this summer is shaping up to be the hottest on record, with June and July already setting worldwide records. We know that studies have shown that climate change is increasing the length, the duration, and the intensity of these extreme heat events. And extreme heat is the deadliest impact of climate change, killing more people than floods or storms. But extreme heat doesn't impact everyone in the same way, with low-income communities, communities of color being the hardest hit. For example, here in New York City, 50% of the heat-related deaths are among Black Americans, Black New Yorkers, even though they're only 25% of the city's population. We also know that heat temperatures can vary widely from block to block. Now, this is often due to the urban heat island effect, which occurs when you have dense concentrations of buildings and pavement that absorb and retain heat, along with the lack of green spaces and tree cover. In urban heat islands, the temperatures rise higher and stay elevated longer than in surrounding areas. Now, we used to think of the urban heat island effect raising temperatures from 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. However, a recent study estimates that 7.1 million people in New York City live in urban heat islands that can raise the temperature by more than 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 78% of our population. And nearly 3.8 million New Yorkers, 41%, experience temperatures elevated at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit due to urban heat islands. Now, the city's own data says East Harlem is typically 2 degrees hotter than the city average in August. But 2 years ago, we took a reporter from the New York Times on our East Harlem heat tour, and they found that East 125th Street was 31 degrees hotter than Central Park West on one August afternoon. 31 degrees. That's why we have an East Harlem heat tour, to really raise awareness of the disparities in the way extreme heat impacts our communities. We also know that extreme heat events result in increased hospital admissions for heat-related illness, as well as cardiovascular and respiratory disorders. Why? Well, because our vulnerable populations are more susceptible, including older adults, children, people with chronic illnesses, pregnant women, and those who work outdoors. Now, these populations often reside in urban heat islands, living in older, poorly maintained apartment buildings that are costlier to cool and to maintain a cool temperature. In fact, the inability to afford an air conditioner, let alone regularly run it during these heat events, is what causes many of these fatalities. Most heat-related deaths occur in homes without air conditioning, or homes that weren't using their air conditioner due to the financial burden caused by running it. At least 50% of public housing tenants do not have air conditioners. Now, energy insecurity, which may rise as we transition from fossil fuel to renewables, currently affects 30 million households in this country. Those most susceptible to extreme heat frequently struggle with their utility bills as they must spend a higher percentage of their household income on the cost of energy. Again, they also tend to live in older, poorly maintained buildings, homes that are less energy efficient, meaning that they're also costlier to cool. And like the temperatures, utility rates continue to climb year after year. In fact, Con Edison just announced yet another rate hike. So that's why we've been advocating for increases to New York State's Home Energy Assistance Program, also known as HEAP, which can provide financial assistance to those struggling to cool their homes. Now, for decades, this program has focused on helping struggling New Yorkers heat their homes in the winter to prevent sickness and death from the cold. But now, due to climate change, we're experiencing higher temperatures in the summer, meaning millions are increasingly needing to cool their homes in the summer to protect themselves from hospitalizations, emergency room visits, and death due to the heat. The HEAP program currently helps households afford an air conditioner or a fan up to $800 in value, but it does not provide assistance for the cost of running those appliances, again, a cost many cannot afford. Now, the state has been unable to expand the cooling assistance program portion of HEAP to subsidize utility costs for people due to a lack of federal funding for the program. A meager 4% of the total HEAP budget is set aside for cooling assistance, 4%. And on this past July 14th, only 24 days into the hottest summer on record, the funding set aside for New York's HEAP cooling assistant program has already run out. Now, Mayor Adams recently announced the importance of allocating more funding to this program, but New Yorkers need relief right now, which is why we're calling on Governor Hochul and Mayor Adams to take immediate action to provide New Yorkers with cooling assistance during this unprecedented crisis. And this really includes emergency funding for HEAP's cooling assistance program to supply life-saving cooling, as we're just halfway through the hottest summer on record. And our elected officials need to think ahead for next year. We must appropriate significantly more funding for the state's cooling program. New York could adopt cooling assistance models like those used in California and New Jersey, which subsidize utility bills in the summer through the HEAP program. Now, for New York, we would need at least $200 million for such a program. And we need that to take into account the growing need for this assistance due to climate change. But we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. We've also been advocating for improvements to the city's cooling center program. In fact, our members audited the cooling centers in northern Manhattan and were horrified by what they found. Some centers did not even have air conditioning. Others didn't know they were designated cooling centers because they're not paid. And some even turned our members away. And we have provided the city with a list of recommendations to improve the program, and the first step would be to adequately fund it. We're also pursuing legislation here in the city to expand the use of green roofs and to plant more street trees in our communities. We're seeking an urban forest master plan and a pilot project on the use of cool pavement. And we're calling for a maximum indoor air temperature. Now, in New York, the law states that if the outside temperature falls below 55 degrees, then the inside air temperature must be at least 68 degrees everywhere in your apartment and in your building. But extreme heat is far deadlier than extreme cold. So why don't we have a maximum indoor air temperature? And that won't happen unless we all take collective action and advocacy to get that done. So that's why we have recently formed an extreme heat coalition with advocates from across the state to better coordinate our state advocacy efforts driving policy action toward extreme heat mitigation, adaptation, and resilience for the long haul. And that requires organizing to build public pressure to mitigate public health issues that harm our communities. It requires collaboration statewide to share information on successful local heat initiatives. And we aim to increase extreme heat risk awareness and preparedness amongst vulnerable communities, as well as to improve energy security and reduce energy poverty. Now, there are a number of statewide coalitions working to reduce the energy burden on our communities through support for the New York Home Energy Affordable Transition Act. It's also known as New York Heat. And it would reduce utility bills by eliminating gas subsidies and capping energy bills at 6% for low and middle income families, saving them up to $75 a month. Now, at this time, extreme heat is one of the deadliest and most consistent impacts of climate change, with CDC estimates at 1,500 deaths last year. But however, wildfire deaths last year climbed to 4,316 in this country. Wildfires contain a mixture of fine particles and other toxins that impact seriously those with underlying conditions. This past June, New York City had the worst air quality in the world due to Canadian wildfires, which sent higher numbers of New Yorkers to the emergency room with asthma complications and respiratory illness. And as we've already seen this summer, the incidence of wildfires and extreme heat is getting worse. So while the toll this summer remains to be documented, the average annual incidence of heat-related deaths in the United States has risen 95% from 2010 to 2022. Now, given this challenge, can you imagine that our funding from the Heat Cooling Assistance Program, our safety net, has already run out, and we need the city and the state to take action now. So that can only happen if we all come together, talk to our elected officials. We had our lieutenant governor here. He needs to know that they've got to find more money for this program. You heard him talk about the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, called CLCPA. And that mandated that 35% as a minimum of all of the investment in clean energy would go to frontline communities. Benefits would go to frontline communities. And the Biden administration has modeled that and now has required that 40% of energy, of clean energy benefits will go to frontline communities. And of course, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, again, is bringing billions of dollars into New York City and into states around the country. I'd just like you to know that the WEAC is a technical assistance center for the EPA and the Department of Energy. We will be providing assistance for any of you all who want to apply for grants. We will be there for New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands to ensure that you have the assistance to apply for these grants and to be linked to federal officials that you may need to know. We are also working with NYSERDA. We are a Manhattan hub for information and grants coming from NYSERDA. So again, please reach out to us. And also we have membership meetings every first Saturday of every month except August. And we would love to see so many of you all there. So thank you for being here. This is incredible to see this room full on this issue. It's really great you're here. I think you now understand the challenge that we have over the next years and the challenge for your families and for the younger generation that's going to be looking for their piece of the pie. How are we going to leave this country and this world and this climate and the planet for that future generation? So that's why we're all here. and it's going to take all of us to make sure we can do that well. Thank you very much.
Miss Peggy Shepard. She's a wonderkind. We honored her last year with Columbia University and surprised her with some original art. And the next thing I knew, she got, what'd you get, Peggy, from Congressman Esbiat? Like $50 billion or something?
No, we did not. No, we did not. Tell me where it is.
But she and her team are wonderful. When we did Earth Day in the spring, she flew in just to be our keynote speaker, and she was at the White House pitching what she pitched to you today. So if anybody's going to be a starting pitcher for me, it's going to be Peggy Shepard. Give it up again for Peggy Shepard. My name is Winston Majette. I serve as Executive Director of the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce and work diligently with a fantastic board, the Harlem Week Board. And we're going to have some of our chamber and board members come up for this next session. This next panel is going to be on environmental justice. What is it? The moderator for that particular segment is going to be Judge Milton Tingling, who is the chairman of the West Harlem Development Corporation. A little bit about Judge Tingling is he's a former justice for the New York County Supreme Court civil term in the First Judicial District of New York. He was elected to this position in 2001, and he retired from the court on December 31st, 2014. To become the New York County Clerk. His education, I might add, I'm very proud of. He received his BA degree from Brown University in 1975, and he went on to get his JD degree from the fabulous HBCU that I'll rub in. I also went to too, North Carolina Central University, and he graduated from the School of Law in 1982. Google him, as he always says. And he also told me to tell you that he is better looking than Denzel Washington. So at this time, I'd like to bring up my friend, my JHCC board member, Judge Milton Tingling Jr.
All right, good evening, everybody. Good evening. All right, I have the enviable task of making sure nobody goes to sleep before we leave this room. All right? All right, so this is going to be exciting. I'll sit down in a moment, but it's really an honor to be here tonight. A couple of years ago, I was actually one of the presenters on environmental justice. That was short. I'm a lifelong Harlem, Washington Heights resident. One of our panel members tonight is here from Con Edison, okay? And one of the ways that you judge that you're a real New Yorker is how many blackouts you were here for, okay? So I'm a real New Yorker. I've been here for all of them. It's really an honor to be here tonight to do this. But before I get started, and believe me, I move a program along, I would be remiss if I don't tell everybody that doesn't know about Peggy Shepard. I met her 30 years ago. We were both, I was getting started and whatnot, and she was an East Harlem district leader, dealing with politics, getting judges elected, dealing with politics. Okay, I'll leave it like that. My description of politics is kissing babies and assorted body parts. Okay? But she made a decision at some point that environmental justice and climate change was a priority for this community. And when she started out, people didn't know. The people she was going to, the people she was doing this for, half of them didn't know what she was talking about. But yet here she is. after all this time. So I want everybody to really recognize you are in the presence of an icon. All right? So give it up. And since it's the 50th anniversary of hip hop, if you didn't know, now you know. All right, so I'm going to ask the panel to come on up. Our first presenter tonight is Donna Walker Coon Esquire. It is, she's one of my members of the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce Legal Committee. She is one of our stars, and this is her field. I know, sorry about the comment. Okay. I know, because you're ready to handle it. And then tonight we have Rosalind Quay, who I'm going to read this, is Con Ed Project Manager, Energy Policy and Regulatory Affairs. It's very important. You know, I joked about Con Ed, but Con Ed actually, what they're doing in terms of working for the environment, for climate justice, okay, is so exciting. Didn't exist in my day, and yet here it is. And so, Rosalind, we're very happy to have you here tonight. Our first panelist is Chris Rice, the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate. All right, so in the interest of full disclosure, I have no idea what they do. Which is why I'm so excited, because I'm going to find out what they do tonight along with everybody else. So we're going to move this program along. One of my things, I like to tell people I'm retired, I just work 4 full-time jobs. But one of the things I do is that I'm very heavily involved with reentry, okay? And the connection between climate justice and reentry is so joined that people don't realize it. We're talking about, you've heard tonight about economics, about how climate disparities affect economics, and economics affects reentry. Okay, all of these things are tied together. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Donna Walker Coon Esquire.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and congratulations to everyone for being here. I think, as you know, Ms. Shepherd said, this is such a critical time. And by taking the time out of your busy schedule means that either you're curious or you're going to be the change maker, but either way, it's extremely valuable. And so thank you so much. Also, thank you to the Chamber for the opportunity to just share some thoughts I have on this topic. And of course, my colleagues from the legal committee, it's a bunch of cowboys on the legal committee, and we talk about a number of different issues, but this has certainly been one of them we've been exploring for the past year or so. So my perspective is through arts and culture. That is the world that I live in, that's the work that I do. And I was asked to talk about the intersection of social justice, community engagement, and the arts, and how does environmental justice impact in that area. So that's what my remarks will be focused on. And so we've heard a number of definitions about, you know, environmental justice and what that means. And I think when I think about it, very much it's about, you know, equity in what people need to be able to live a quality of life. I love your focus, Dr. Parker. Yes, about dignity. I love that. I think that's so important. And so equity and dignity to me parallel tracks, you know, when we think about what this, how does environmental justice apply to this? But it's also a social movement. And I think, you know, Ms. Shepherd has certainly indicated that this is a movement that each of us, you know, play an important role. And so when we think about, okay, how does this move forward? Starting with Dr. Boudreau's remarks, we heard about environmental racism. And so racism is very much integrated into what are the opportunities and the disparities and the barriers that we experience. And so I want us to look at what does this mean in arts and culture, and what can artists do to also be advocates as change makers, as we've been tasked to do this evening. And so, you know, I think there's several opportunities, that we have as artists to think about what can we do to move this needle forward. But I also want to point out that environmental justice, in addition to what we've been talking about, the extreme heat and the wildfires, the pollution, it's also the quality of life. It's also the environment in which we work. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but in 2020, the actors and producers and behind the scenes makers of Broadway put together a document called We See You, White America. And it was about environmental justice. It was about the quality of life that artists of color in particular experience while working on Broadway, either on stage or behind the scenes. And this document really is a 33-page document. And it really highlighted the inequities that they experienced as their day-to-day job, coming to work as an artist and what they've been facing. So, the result of this, the ask was how do we create an anti-racist environment? How do we bring justice to how people live and work and so things that they're so passionate about. I remember reading one story about one of the actors in a Broadway play. He, during the intermission, one of the producers came to him and said, "Don't sing so passionately. You're not at church." And he was just so hurt because he loved singing. This was something he felt so strongly about. So again, I'm just kind of broadening, what we think about with environmental justice in addition to what we experience externally is also what we experience internally. And many of the signatories to the We See You, White America document talked about how they feel when they go to work and what they don't feel and not being embraced and not being acknowledged and honored. So I just wanted to point that out as well. I think about how the arts can help shape the narrative on the need to act for climate change. And we're an essential role. Without the arts, there's no storyline that continues from generation to generation, century to century. And so as someone mentioned, Ms. Shepherd, you mentioned about, so what are we leaving for the future? What will our children inherit? And I think the arts are exactly the perfect platform to be able to address, what this change can look like. And so, someone clapping? Oh, yes, I agree, yes. So, first of all, I think we have to have a commitment to arts and activism as a means to combat climate change. And with so much at stake on our planet, the work that artists do is essential in moving the public. So we talk about building awareness. Okay, so we have fabulous people that are messaging this to us, like Ms. Shepherd, like everyone who's been on these panels. Artists play a critical role in this as well. We have the platform to reach people. We have that. We have various mechanisms to do that, but there has to be a commitment to do it, and I think we have the power to do that. So this is something I think is really important, how we can advance, reflect, and shape solutions to environmental problems. That is something that artists, absolutely have to be aware of. We also have to be conscious as an artist, what are we doing to contribute to the pollution of this country? What art are we developing? So producing artwork sometimes takes a major toll on the environment. The materials could be toxic and they add to the carbon that's being released. And so being mindful of, yes, I want to produce this, but what's the impact? Am I making sure that I'm protecting the very place that I want to think about? There was an interesting exhibit at San Francisco State University. It was called Clearly Polluted, The Fight for Environmental Justice. And it really talked about environmental racism and the disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And what I really liked about reading this article, because it talked about, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, it said really tipped the scales in the awareness of, people around the world. And climate justice is racial justice. So there's no separation. So we're talking about the interconnectedness of all of this, From the moment you wake up, are you too hot? Okay, can you go and create the work that you want to do? Can you go and see the art exhibition? Well, it's time to get to the museum because I got to take the train and it's too hot. I'm not going to go. So it's all one through line. And so I don't think we can look at this in separate kind of portals. And so addressing these injustices, that continue to happen historically also enables us to look at how can we disrupt racism, as it affects the quality of our lives. So shaping the narrative of the arts, through our work, I think that theater makers, dancers, choreographers, visual artists, spoken words, yes, the 50th anniversary of hip hop, music, all of these pieces can exemplify what does climate change look like and what is our role and how can we transform that, because we have a platform to do it. And so I wanted to point out that there have been trailblazers who've actually been advocating climate change through their art and through their music. And I was actually impressed with this list because I think we're familiar with many of the artists. One is an African-American artist who's a photographer, sculptor, and performance artist. Her name is Allison Hamilton. And she's been focusing on environmental justice for years. What we're seeing is artists of color are not spoken about as advocates for environmental justice. We usually hear about it that white people are doing it, but there are people of color have been also using their platform as artists. So now's the time for us to lift them up and to really support them. I'm sure you're all familiar with the author, Octavia Butler, or her book, Parable of Sower. That's what it's about. It's about climate change, and it's been heralded as something really important about that. Ayanna Johnson, who talked about Hurricane Katrina, and the impact of that. So we have artists that have been advocating this, artists of color, who have been really advocating this change, but it's been very quiet, and that's where we see examples of systemic racism and burying those voices and those faces. So we want to center the work of artists of color, on climate. We also have, if you remember, Donald Glover. He released the best climate song since Marvin Gaye's Mercy, Mercy Me. And that was in 1971, Marvin Gaye's song. Donald Glover released his song, Feels Like Summer, in the summer of 2018. And that was under his name, Childish Gambino. That song had 180 million views on YouTube and 140 million streams on Spotify, making it the farthest reaching pieces of climate art ever. But did you know this? No. Exactly. That's the point. And so I'm talking about is celebrating the work that our artists of color have been doing for many, many years. And this is just such an important point. So, I think about, okay, how do we move things forward? One, we continue to advocate and support the artists who are making noise about climate change and environmental justice. We look at, how, I love the advocacy that has come out of these discussions because artists have to be at the forefront of that. This is not the time to be silent and quiet. So we use our work, but we also use our voices, so that we can really bring about change. Also, Angelique Kidjo, whom I know we all love, her album, Mother Nature, is also about celebrating the earth. So there's so many ways that artists can embrace what does this mean. Not everyone may walk out on the picket line and say, stop this, change this. So at home, when you're creating the art, the messaging needs to be embedded in that as well. So I believe now is the time. We've been given a direction. We know that this is, we have to make sure that we use every single opportunity, every portal that we can find that will say, stop this now. And so let's move forward with that collectively, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. That was wonderful. So our next speaker is Rosalind Olson. Kanye.
All right, I want to get the rules straight, Judge, because are we talking about challenges now, or do you want to cover that separately?
Well, what I like to do is I'm very big into audience engagement. Okay, so I thought if everybody would present, because I want to get to the Q&A and let the audience participate.
Okay, great. All right, so I know where to go. I'm going to pick up on the theme of interconnectedness, because we got little jabs at Con Edison today, but we are a long-standing New York City resident, right? Our company was founded in 1823. We just celebrated our 200th birthday earlier this year. And we've been in New York with New York. We have 14,000 employees. We live in the city, myself included. I'm a Harlem resident as well. And so we are a part of the fabric of this city. And we're also an important partner in achieving the CLCPA goals. We're proud to be the largest energy utility in the state. And we live in a state arguably with the most ambitious climate goals in the country. So we're committed to the clean energy transition, and we believe it can be achieved, even though the CLCPA goals are aggressive. But we have our clean energy commitment. It is our pledge to transform our business in support of achieving the CLCPA goals and others that you might discuss as well, right, that the city has. And we have a diverse service territory, so it's important, essential for us to always be engaged with our communities. So, we have several initiatives that we're working on. Something I wanted to highlight is that we have established an internal environmental justice working group that is looking at how we apply the equity lens to everything we do at Con Edison and our sister company, Orange and Rockland Utilities, right? Both of those businesses. And it was formed by the sponsorship of our Vice President of Environment, Health and Safety and our General Counsel. And I happen to be a co-chair of that group. And we have a couple of members here in the audience tonight. Sean and Kimberly, if you want to raise your hands. Okay, so you can, if you want to chat with us after, we're happy to talk about what we're doing. But our vision, right, is to collaborate with the other organizations that are responsible for implementing our operational requirements and other obligations that we have as a regulated business. And we have this obligation to serve our customers safe and reliable energy. And that's the prime directive, so to speak. So, we've heard tonight, there are several challenges associated with doing this, with making this transition, which is absolutely necessary. And there are three of them that I wanted to cover. First, that being affordability. We know that there will be costs associated with the clean energy transition, right? We have programs and policies in place as a company to help shield our most vulnerable customers from the cost of the transition. We have been participating in an energy affordability policy working group that the Department of Public Service, right, the staff arm of the New York State Public Service Commission, convened in September of 2021. And it's a cross-functional group. So we have stakeholders that include the utilities across the state, DPS, of course, is involved, and then advocates, Public Utility Law Project, the Utility Intervention Unit, the Department of State, advocates from all over who are involved, and we're working together to figure out how to tackle this challenge. So you may have heard about the COVID arrears relief program that we successfully put in place. So Con Edison specifically has provided over $620 million in arrears relief to residential and small commercial customers, starting with, thank you, right, with customers that are enrolled in our low-income bill discount program, which you may have heard is we rebranded the Energy Affordability Program. But that was, a large share of the 1.1 billion with a B that was given out statewide. And the company itself, Con Edison, we contributed $45.5 million to that $620 million that I mentioned earlier. We also have, as a working group, figured out ways to standardize the enrollment process. We have a self-certification form that's available statewide. It's consistent, and we increase our outreach to help get the word out to people about ways that they can enroll in the program. And we've actually seen an uptick since June of 2022, statewide, an additional 53,000 people enrolled in the energy affordability programs in the utilities across the state. And we heard Ms. Shepherd refer to our rate plan that was recently approved. We actually, like, the customers will see a decrease, see some lower bills. Low-income customers will see lower bills under the most recently approved rate plan. And that's thanks to expansion of the energy affordability program. So those are some of the ways, not all, that we're addressing the affordability challenge. We've also heard about the challenge with building electrification, and this is a huge one because we have, an older building stock, hard to electrify buildings, and a lot of high rises and multifamily buildings in our service territory. But our energy efficiency programs, and again, I'm going to shout out Sean, who's here, he's from the energy efficiency group. That's the first puzzle of the piece. And in 2022, Con Edison provided electric and gas customers over $490 million in incentives to choose energy saving technologies like heat pumps, HVAC upgrades, lighting upgrades, in order to help address the challenge. And of course, Harlem residents are eligible and do participate in those programs. And we're also, as a company, looking to offer new technology as alternatives to fossil fuels. So we have pilots that we've proposed in the utility thermal energy network space. 3 of them we have, and 2 of them are in Manhattan. And one of them would serve 4 different NYCHA properties, right? We're also looking at how we can decarbonize our steam system, and that can be an alternative, right? Bringing customers onto steam who are transitioning off of oil or natural gas. And I'll shout out NYCHA again. That's one of our New York City Housing Authority, one of our largest customers. And recently we brought the Baruch houses have agreed to come onto the steam system. They're transitioning away from fossil fuel. Okay, so another huge challenge. We've heard about maintaining reliability and resiliency. Super important. As a threshold matter, when it comes to reliability, the Con Edison system is about 5 to 7 times more reliable than others across the country because of most of our system is, we have a lot of underground facilities in New York. And that said, for decades, we've been building our energy infrastructure for the immediate need. And now we're in a position where we need to reimagine the future and start to build ahead. So we're thinking about how we expand our system to accommodate new sources of energy from renewables and the increased demand on the electric system as customers transition away from fossil fuel. But in order to do that, we have to invest. And that's why we have, as Ms. Shepherd mentioned, our most recent rate plan approved. We're also advocating for regulatory approval to build ahead for EV charging infrastructure, right? Preparing the grid ahead of the need. And coming up later this year, we'll be filing an updated climate vulnerability study, as well as a climate resilience filing later in November. And we have a multi-party working group that we work with here again to prepare these resilience and reliability filings. So that group includes DPS staff, WEACT participates, the mayor's office, MTA, Port Authority, labor unions. So this is really taking a whole economy, multi-party approach to this. So one more area I want to cover is investing in what the state is called in the CLCPA, disadvantaged communities. We've heard different terms today, frontline communities, fence communities. Disadvantaged communities is a term I use because that's how the state has defined it. So we as a company are seeking to enhance the health and wealth of disadvantaged communities. So as I mentioned earlier, we've stood up the Environmental Justice Working Group. We're looking how to apply the equity lens in everything we do. The company is also looking at ways to engage communities in the process of delivering this transition, so that as we're building projects in communities, we're doing the outreach up front, not coming to them with a packaged project saying, oh, by the way, we're doing this, but looking to do the outreach up front and engage in a dialogue to help them shape what the final project looks like. An example of that is for our Brooklyn Clean Energy Hub. Our Brooklyn Regional and Community Affairs team actually held a forum with the community to talk about the project. And we'll be taking that feedback and incorporating it into the plans. We also have a wonderful program, our Clean Energy Academy. And again, I have to shout out my colleague Sean here, who has been instrumental in helping to grow that program. So it establishes a pipeline of skilled workforce who are working on our energy efficiency programs and implementation of those programs. So we've had over 700 graduates to date. Over 700. At least 50% of the participants have been recruited from populations that include veterans, people who are in the 18 to 24-year-old age range, previously incarcerated individuals, and people who reside in under-resourced communities. We also have revamped our corporate giving program so that we have focus areas. And so climate adaptation, STEM programming, and social justice are areas that we have designated program managers assigned to, and we'll be looking to direct our funds in those areas. And of course, we have our partnership program, longstanding partnerships with Harlem Grown, Abyssinian Development Court, and CUNY Building Performance Lab. So those are in place. And from an operational standpoint, we're bringing in data about disadvantaged communities as we make decisions about our capital projects portfolios. So to the extent we can use presence in a disadvantaged community as a weighting factor, we are doing that. You know, recognizing that some things are, there are many factors that go into how we develop our portfolio, but to the extent we can take it into account, we do. We'll also be, just a heads up, reporting out on our investment in disadvantaged communities and operational metrics as an outgrowth of the most recent rate plan that was approved. There's a disadvantaged communities report that the company will issue every year, and we'll have stakeholder meetings following the release of that report. So stay tuned for that. Now, when it comes to urban heat island mitigation, we are installing monitors on our facilities to get more accurate temperature readings around the system. And that will serve a dual purpose, helping us to assess the situation on the ground, not only for community members, but also for our equipment. And we are a member of the Forest for All NYC Coalition. And we actually submitted testimony to support the legislation that Ms. Shepherd mentioned about creating an urban, a plan to grow the tree canopy in New York City. So those are some of the things that I wanted to highlight. I mean, that's not even, that's truncated from what I started out with. But I want to leave you with that, you know, it's not Con Edison versus everybody else. We are a part of the community. We live in the community. We are a longstanding New York City resident. We are passionate, and we are doing our part to the extent we can from inside to help contribute to bringing about this clean energy future in a way that is equitable.
Thank you, Robinson. I've never heard that side of this before. Very fascinating. Okay, so much going on. So our next speaker is Chris Rice. And as I told you before, I have no idea who this is. But I'm very, very interested. But before I do, I got 3 questions I need to ask. Okay, how many people drove here tonight? Drove. All right, drove. How many people took public transportation? All right, and how many people biked here? Very interesting. Huh? Now, walking doesn't count. But Chris, so ready for this education. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Rice. I'm the Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. I work for the city, so I'm going to try not to get too wonky, and I know it's getting late, so I'm going to keep my remarks short. But I'm really here to share with you what the city is doing to advance EJ in New York City, and want to share what we collectively call EJ NYC, which really represents the implementation of 2 sort of groundbreaking laws that were passed by City Council back in 2017. And there are 3 main components to this work. There's an EJ report and mapping tool that will be coming out this fall, and then a forthcoming EJ NYC plan, which is really the actions and city recommendations to address the disparities we find in the report. So just quickly to give you a sense of what the report is going to include, we're going to start with a history of the report. You can't talk about EJ in New York City without acknowledging colonization, slavery, discriminatory practices such as redlining. And then from there, we'll really move into what we call the state of EJ today, which is the real focus of the report. We're going to go, it's the city's first comprehensive report on EJ, so it's a really important moment. And we go through sort of data point by data point, topic by topic, to really outline where we're seeing disparities and inequities in New York City. We look at food, access to transit, access to jobs. We're looking at polluted air, proximity to hazardous materials, housing, polluted water, climate change. So this is a real comprehensive effort, and it is just a start. The second piece is the mapping tool, which we're extremely excited about. Right now, it's up to around 90 data layers, sort of related to the report. And this is a tool that is for New York City residents, it's for CBOs and EJ organizations, and it's also for city agencies. And the real goal of this tool is to increase transparency and ensure that residents have the ability to really understand EJ and how the various issues are interconnected. How does extreme heat relate to PM 2.5? How does it relate to premature births? We really want to show visually how those things relate to one another, and also have it be accessible, all be downloadable for everyone who accesses the tool. And then lastly, a report is just a report, and a mapping tool is just a tool. Once those come out in the fall, we'll be shifting into the actual plan process. We'll be working with our interagency working group and our advisory board to really put recommendations, put pen to paper on how we can address these inequities. I do want to highlight 2 other groups that the law established. One is our EJ Advisory Board, which we have the honor of being chaired by Peggy Shepard from We Act. When I saw Peggy tonight, she said, "Chris, where's the report? When's it coming out?" I told her it's coming soon. That board is sort of half CBOs and EJ organizations and half academics, folks working in public health, environmental law. And the second group it established is our interagency working group, which is a group such as city planning, the Department of Transportation, the health department, other city agencies, and they're the ones that are really sort of tasked with embedding EJ in city decision making. And just to highlight, I think it's important to sort of call out what we define as environmental justice from the city perspective, and it's really 2 types of equity. We're looking at distributional equity, which is sort of where things are placed throughout the city, how are burdens and benefits environmentally sort of shared and distributed, and then procedural equity. So how are New Yorkers involved in city processes, and particularly thinking about frontline communities and EJ communities. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the challenges that I've noticed in the work that I've been leading so far. One is just the consistency of data. We need to understand where investments are made, how often they're made, and who they're benefiting. And we see a really big sort of gap in that information for a lot of agencies. That'll be really important moving forward. I think there's also important to highlight this tension of the urgency to act now. We know that kids are growing up with asthma, we see premature births, all things that are preventable. But we also know that this, to really advance EJ, it's going to be, that long-standing systemic change in policies that we need to implement to address this issue. And lastly, the thing I want to highlight is I think we're at such an important watershed moment for EJ. We see offices like ours being established in cities. At the federal level, there's an office at EJ now. But I think it's important, and this is something that I'm going to be holding on to as we move into the plan process, which is, I don't speak for EJ communities. Our office does not speak for EJ communities. And as we move this work forward, we still need to uplift and go to EJ communities and hear directly from them as we plan to address these disparities. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
All right. Good, thank you very much. I feel smarter than I did before you started. I know most of us did. So listen, everybody, we're going to do the program like this. I'm going to invite the first panel back up. We're going to see them, okay? Now, I know you were all looking forward to me regaling you with my opinions about congestion pricing. That's right, I'm a Manhattan kid, okay? But we don't have time, okay? So, I'm gonna invite the other panel members back up, and we're going to ask that the audience, we're gonna take questions, but we do one question per panel. Okay? I know that's tight, okay? I will get to you. So Dan and Robbie and Taskia, please come on back up. All right, now remember, one question per panel. Okay, young lady. Please stand up, identify yourself, and who's your question for?
It's a general question. First off, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's so important that we are having this conversation. I am moved. I am getting confirmation from all of you, and I thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing. I had the pleasure of meeting Ms. Peggy Shepard the other week, and just to see everyone doing this work is important. But my question is, while it's important what we're talking about, the people in the room, I'm sure we already know about these things. So how are we getting this information out to the public? What sort of campaign are we going to do so that we can ensure that New Yorkers get this information and they know how to mitigate through all of these issues that we're talking about, these issues that are directly impacting them? Thank you.
All right, who wants to take that? Someone volunteer?
I could directing that at someone in particular.
It's a general
It's a
question,
general
so whoever
question.
would like to take the question.
Tim, you want to take that? Chris?
Yeah, I can take that. That's a great question. I think we're continually thinking about engagement and getting this information out. I think as we get closer to the mapping tool release and the report release, we're going to be working with the board on a series of engagement events to really spread the word and share the information. And I think, especially as we move into the plan phase, foregrounding this work in EJ communities, working with them to develop the plan is going to be critical. And so I think for us, we want to meet people where they are. We want to share this information through the networks that already exist. People don't come to us. People don't even know that our office exists. And so for us, it's about plugging into those organizations, neighborhood groups, churches, other social media. And so I think that is very much going to be the approach that we take in terms of getting this information out.
All right,
Thank you.
and we're gonna move around. Gentleman there, yes, sir. By the way, getting that information out meant churches for us older people and TikTok for the younger ones.
But also billboards.
No, you got it. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you all for your sharing. It was really great. I was curious about in light of the recent wildfires. I've just realized that similar to I think some of the sharings about during extreme heat when people want to shelter at home, but then what do you do to protect people from heat? I'm thinking about indoor air quality exposure, and also being indoors. I realized a lot of people around my block they started buying a lot of air purifiers for homes. Oh yeah, sorry. So yeah, I was wondering what are the environmental justice considerations with respect to that, or policy descriptions that can be done in that type of indoor air quality in light of climate change?
Okay, yes, Doc.
So I can take that. So after the air quality event definitely very much shook us. So before I joined FIFRA and before I joined the mayor's office, I worked for the Obama administration for many years and then also worked internationally supporting cities on their own climate action plans. And so a lot of the cities that I worked with included cities in India like Ahmedabad who face air quality emergency events pretty often. Like what was, for me in New York City, a first in a lifetime experience is a very regular day-to-day occurrence for residents living there. And so what we did at FIFRA is we started to look at what other cities, so not just in the US, not just in India, but across the US, across the Northeast, across Canada, seeing how they, who have for years been dealing with air quality crises, how they've been dealing with it and addressing it, and what ideas we could import to New York City, because as we know, these crises are going to become more frequent in number as well as in intensity. And so some of the things that I think first is just, the first thing to consider is that we need to reduce additional pollution. Like there are air quality pollutants in our neighborhoods. There are truck routes, there are bus routes, there are, there's just so many, there's construction that's happening that causes more particulate matter pollution. There's baseline pollution that New Yorkers are exposed to day to day. And so one of the things that we could do is when we do have extreme air quality city road repavings or on certain construction activities, let's try to think of ways where we can actually cut down on the additional pollution that we're generating in our city. Second is thinking about how to reduce New Yorkers' exposure to this pollution. So the way that we have these cooling centers for extreme heat events, we should also be thinking about doing that for clean air centers. So places that we know have air filters ready to go, places that you can go to get more resources. And we have several other recommendations related to that. And then thirdly, we talk about how to just make sure that New Yorkers are prepared and make sure that our city and our government is prepared. And one of the things that we talk about is creating an air quality emergency response training. So the city already trains a lot of community groups. Folks here can get trained to learn about how to respond to certain emergencies, like if there's a terrorist attack or an earthquake, you can be trained to guide your community and lead them out of the emergency. So you're equipped with resources and knowledge, so you are aware of how to let the people in your network guide to safety. So we should have something like that for air quality. That could involve setting up networks with community leaders. So the city should have a listserv of here are a bunch of churches and mosques and synagogues, and these are the networks that they're able to target. Folks can get information from those networks before they're going to get information from a mayoral press release that no one checks or reads. And so there are a number of strategies that the city could take and that we're advocating for them to take. Because as we know, this is such a critical issue and it is the most important for environmental justice communities who are already, as we've heard over and over again, being disproportionately impacted by these effects.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna give to you. Young lady over here.
Hi, my name is Alexandra, and I guess this panel, or this question goes to any of the panelists, but specifically for the second panel. I was aware that we talked about the roots of what we're dealing with, and racism and the legacies was brought up, but I have a question as to why we didn't talk about capitalism. Slavery directly was wealth building, so there was no discussion about class intersection and how that leads to what we're dealing with now. The pathology or the incessant need for growth, for economic growth, is directly tied to emissions and greenhouse gas emissions specifically. So if we want to talk about more of how we help our communities, I have a question as to why we're not talking about the actual roots. And specifically for Con Ed made $2.4 billion in profits this year, which was a 52% increase from its last fiscal year, and at the same time had more disconnections than since COVID. Con Ed, as well as other utilities in New York, put in a proposal in February of this year asking for an increase over the next 3 years to their customers, which would offset to customers $17 more per month on electricity, I believe, and over $102 a month for gas. So when we're talking about solutions, I think we also have to think about responsibilities and whose responsibilities is for why we are here. And this is a broader question to the panel, but I directly want to ask, why aren't we also talking about the actual roots?
Okay, yeah, she called me out, so she called me out. So there is an aspect of environmental justice that requires looking back at what role we played as a company. Now, whether or not we take it all the way back to the era of chattel slavery, I don't know that that's necessarily like a requirement in order to remediate the situation that we're in today, and then plan to move forward in a way that's different from where we've been. History is important. I agree with that. We also are operating within a framework that's existing, and it's not up to Con Edison only to change it, right? We are a regulated monopoly, a natural monopoly. We want to talk about the economics of our business. There's a portion of it, a lot of the costs that we incur are passed through to customers. Those include the cost of the energy that we deliver, property taxes, which is a huge issue, about a third of customer bills attributed to property taxes. And as we build new infrastructure, that's going to be an issue because we're taxed on the value of our assets that we depreciate over time, right? So why are we talking about capitalism? So there's a system, right? We're regulated. New York State Public Service Commission, they have a role to play. Customers have a role to play. Third-party advocates have a role to play. All of these are participants in our rate cases. And so I would say the responsibility lies with all of us to be a check. And the way our business model works is not only up to Con Edison. We do seek to deploy our funds in a way that's responsible and in the best interest of our customers. And as I mentioned before, prime directive, safe and reliable service at just and reasonable rates. So that's what I can offer. I can't, yeah.
Okay.
So I can offer. Yeah.
Okay, so listen. All right. We've come to the end of the program. One more question. And I'm gonna tell you now, all right, I haven't been off the bench that long. If there's not a question, I'm gonna cut you off. All right, sir? No, gentleman is gonna ask you.
My name is David Brown. So I'm sorry, it's not a question.
If it's not a question.
So I'm a small business owner and I'm just here trying to be the change, right? So this is a piece of technology. It's actually technology. It's not electricity, but the technology is in the design. And it's all about water conservation. Me specifically, I've been on an onslaught of just attacking the DEC, the Parks Department. And to answer your question, the DEC is giving money away just to pay you to talk about environmental justice. So that's one way you can get the word out. I just want everybody's number on the panel just to talk to you guys privately and independently about being the change and keep changing. And I was just at a mayor's office event, and it was all about procurement. It was in Long Island City, and I felt bad because there was nothing there for agriculture or environmental justice. So it's funny that I see you here today, and I'm not going to let you guys go.
All right.
Thank you very much.
And for those of you who have other questions or comments, you can reach us at info@greaterharlemchamber.com. So at this time, I'd like to present to you or bring back to you our President and CEO of the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Lloyd Williams.
First of all, let me just say this. I try to say these things. You know, God has a plan. And there is the reason why you are all here today. So many places you could have been, so many things you could have done. And so you have something in common with everyone who is here. You need to understand that. And what you need to do is before you leave, meet two persons who are here that you didn't know when you came in. Introduce yourself, find out who they are and why they are here. I hope that you appreciated our efforts to communicate. Now to Con Edison, I want to go to the thing on Con Edison. Hey, listen, we all understood the position that the representative was put in, and that she was in fact very effective in responding to it, and we appreciate that. But at the end of the day, the problem is not Con Edison. The problem is us. It's us. Okay, because we vote for the people who regulate Con Edison. And why are we voting them back in office all the time if they're not regulating Con Edison? Okay? So oftentimes what happens is we take these positions, we have these titles, and we believe that the titles are real. They're imaginary. Today you are Miss Citibank, and when you leave Citibank tomorrow, who are you then? Okay? And so all I'm saying is, Con Edison, what they're doing is unconscionable. Everybody in this room, including your representative, knows that. But whose fault is that? Okay? Who's responsible for that? We must take the responsibility, which is why we came up with the theme, be the change. You can be the change. And you may think that what you do is irrelevant, but sometimes just speaking to someone else and saying, hey, I have a problem with what's going on. What do you think? So part of the change is not pointing fingers necessarily at each other, but looking at what we have. You know, I said before, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. said it's what's in your hand. Okay? Oftentimes we focus on what we don't have. But there's something we do have. We have a brain, we have a mouth, and we have people we can communicate with. These distinguished people who took their evening to come and share with you, I hope you will appreciate that which they did and give them a hand. But in the little time that we have left, please do mix and mingle. see each other, touch each other, exchange numbers with each other, and make sure that you understand that climate change is in our hands. We can be the change. Thank you all for coming out.
I'll tell you all the time.